Someone, a person who is sentenced to 90 days or less in the LA County Jail, the typical inmate, serves no time at all.
No time at all.
I was shocked when I read the book.
You might be surprised to discover how little time convicts serve for even the most serious crimes, and how few crimes are ever solved or even prosecuted. That and more is in Walt Lewis's new book, The Criminal Justice Club. He blames the liberal media. And Patty Malone, a communications professor and former TV anchor, is here to represent the liberal media. Great to have you here today, Patty.
Good to be here. Thank you very
Walt,
much.
a pleasure.
My pleasure.
So I think you make a great point in this book that, a lot of times on the news when really any story about a crime, you'll hear they may face up to 20 years in prison. What does 20 years in prison really mean here in California when you hear the maximum sentence? Or can you give us some examples?
Well, very few crimes would you do 20 years in prison. Most of our prison sentences are measured in months, right, not years. And for felonies in Los Angeles County, only about 35% of the convicted felons even go to prison. 65% of convicted felons in LA County, or give or take a percent, are placed on probation, with some time in the county jail. But as the Los Angeles Times reported, a county jail sentence of 1 year for the typical inmate means 24 days. 24 days. And
so how do you go from 1 year sentence to 24 days? How does that work?
It comes down to overcrowding, and what happened is that in 1988, the federal court gave the authority to the LA County Sheriff to release as many county jail inmates as necessary to control overcrowding. And the sheriff has delegated that authority to clerks in the sheriff's department. And so, for example, a person who is sentenced to 90 days or less in the LA County Jail, the typical inmate, serves no time at all.
No time at all. Well, in fact, that really came to light in a strange national kind of way with the Paris Hilton case, where when she was sentenced and then everyone was outraged when she was let go almost immediately, and people thought something funny was going on, and she was sent back. But you're saying anybody who gets less than 90 days doesn't even serve any time.
That's right, and that's due to overcrowding.
So she actually spent more time. She got a raw deal, actually.
She did.
She was being used as an example.
She did.
Right.
Yeah.
However, she could have gotten out because she could have compared her situation to all of the others who do get out, and for reasons known to her and her lawyer, she chose to stay in.
Right. And of course, at that point, as you point out, that's the way the system works until you get a lot of media exposure, and then things can also go funny too. But in a normal case, though, most people aren't serving a whole lot of jail time. But isn't that true, though? I mean, there's a tendency for the news anchor, you always report the maximum possible sentence.
Yeah, I think what happens is people will ask the question, how long can they serve in prison? And that's what they get. They get that kind of response. Maybe a better question might be, what would be the minimum that they could get? What would be the maximum that they could get?
Or what are they
likely
what are
to
they
serve?
really going to get?
Yeah, what are they likely to actually serve in the jail? But I don't think most people are even aware of that. I really think that it's basically ignorance. I was shocked when I read the book, and I read those statistics. I was totally stunned.
Because I think, honestly, truthfully, maybe you would agree with this, maybe not, but I think, it does, I don't say sound more sensational, but more gripping to say that someone may get 20 years in prison, with the best of intentions. I mean, it's more, grabs your attention.
Yes, it does.
But then along comes Walt and says, no, in California, 20 years. I mean, again, if you explain to us how this works, but if you get a sentence of 20 years for whatever crime that would be, you get 50% off right off the top?
Well, the 50% off applies to what are called determinate sentences. It doesn't apply to murder. And it doesn't apply to three strikers, and it doesn't apply to people who have been convicted of their second strike. People who have been convicted of their second strike get 20% off. But everybody else, other than those categories, gets 50% off.
What are the most serious crimes, though, that can still get 50%? I mean, your first murder, would you get 50% off?
No. Murder, you don't get 50% off.
But armed robbery, rape, something like that?
Robbery, you would get 50% off. Rape, you would get 50% off. Unless it's a life maximum. Life maximums are not earning 50% good time, work time credits.
Because you just had some striking examples in the book of really doing the math of how little time people actually get when it's reported that they get X in the news. You know, you show how little time they really get in comparison.
Right.
Especially if they end up in county jail.
I cite a lot of statistics about how much time prisoners do around the country, and some statistics on how much time they do in California.
But often, except for the special cases you mentioned, murder and the 3 strike, or I guess even 2nd strike convictions, people get the 50% off. Do you know what percentage of people that would be overall for felonies? And how did that come about? Why do people get 50% off their jail time right off the top?
You have to go back to 1978 when in California we went from indeterminate sentences to determinate sentences for almost all crimes except murder.
Roughly speaking, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but that means something like instead of just using their best judgment, the judge has to follow some kind of a law or a guidebook about what the sentences should be?
For example, robbery in California calls for a range of either 2, 3, or 4 years in prison.
Okay.
And burglary is 2, 4, or 6. So if you're sentenced, most people plead guilty. Most people, about 90% plead guilty. So if a defendant pleads guilty to burglary, let's say, he'll usually get the low term if he goes to prison at all,
okay,
which is 2 years. But he does 1 year because he gets half off. Now,
so we've already gone from the news would report that as what? You said it's a maximum of 6 it could have been?
Yes.
So the news report would face 6.
They could stand to be in prison for 6 years, is likely what they would say.
But you're saying that he's going to get 2 and then he's going to get 50% off the top.
yeah,
You're down to 1.
It's really almost impossible to get 6 years.
Almost impossible.
Even though the news media always reports the maximum. And so people, of course, are misled. Prospective jurors are misled in many ways, not just about sentencing, but many, many other ways. Jurors are people who become jurors come into the jury box with preconceived ideas based upon what they've learned from the media.
I don't think that's intentional, though, on the media's part. I honestly think a lot of that is ignorance, because that's not my experience from the people I've known throughout the years working in news, that they would never intentionally report something like that to be misleading.
No, that's why they need to read my book.
Yes, they do.
I think this is a great news story here. That's why we're doing this show today. I mean, this is like a news flash.
Right.
I honestly think a lot of people, well, you say even what probably the media, the police, I mean, the question really comes down to whether, I know you blame the liberal media, but whether it's misinforming or lack of awareness. You know what I mean? But you think, though, that sometimes it goes beyond that. I know you mentioned the LA Times a lot. You think that they intentionally try to misstate the facts about certain things?
Yes. In some respects, there have been much information from the LA Times over the years, and I document that over 30 years. And so I don't think that it's even debatable. I quote them many times, especially when they're asking their readers to vote on ballot initiatives that they usually oppose when it comes to the criminal justice system. And on many occasions, they will give a reason for their opposition that just isn't true. And we don't have time to go through all that now, but there are several examples of that in the book.
We'll be right back. And we are back today discussing Walt Lewis's book, The Criminal Justice Club. You get that title, I'll let you explain the details, but you were roughly speaking a prosecutor here in LA County for 32 years. But you say very few people are on the inside and really know how the criminal justice system works, and that's one of the reasons you wrote this book.
That's right. The Criminal Justice Club, as I define the club, is comprised of the deputy district attorneys, the criminal defense attorneys, both public defenders and private attorneys, defense attorneys, the criminal court judges, and the career criminals who go through the system many times. And I don't include other attorneys, civil lawyers, divorce lawyers, and personal injury lawyers.
You give examples of why people shouldn't use attorneys from other fields for criminal cases just because they're so out of touch with the way it really works.
Exactly. The only people who know how the criminal justice system works are the members of the Criminal Justice Club, and it's a pretty exclusive club.
Some of the other people, again, you said, so other attorneys from other fields, but I believe you're leaving out the media, certainly the general public and the police, and a lot of people who really
Right.
aren't clued in on.
Right.
Well, another thing, a great point you bring up is plea bargaining, which is often a dirty word or a dirty term. Can you explain why 90% you say of defendants in LA County plead guilty?
Yes.
And why that happens and why it's a necessity, you say?
Yes, it is a necessity. District attorneys file cases in only the strongest factual situations. We reject 33, 35, sometimes up to 40% of all cases that the police bring us, felony cases to file.
Felony cases. And these span from murder, rape, robbery,
all
anything.
kinds. They span the spectrum of crime. And we sometimes have an adversarial relationship with the police detective at the time of filing because the police detective feels very strongly that this person is guilty.
Because there's a perception, as you also say in the book, and sorry to interrupt, but the idea is that the prosecutors or DAs are just going crazy out there charging everybody willy-nilly and that people are falsely accused. And do you think the media gives that portrayal or not?
I don't. That has not been my experience at all. We don't, most of us do not see people as being innocent victims who are in jail. We sympathize more with the real victims of the crimes. And I've seen that time and time again because we see the crime victims. We see unbelievable things when we cover stories out in the field. We've seen, murder victims. We've seen bodies in the most unbelievable conditions. We're not too likely to feel sympathetic to the person who's in jail serving time for committing that murder. Our sympathies are more with the actual victims themselves. So I don't really feel that. That has not been my experience. I can't speak for the LA Times. I don't know about that, but I would say in general, in TV news in particular, I have not found that to be true at all.
And I agree with what she just said with respect to individual reporters who are on the scene. What I'm talking about is more institutional misinformation. And you have both read the book, and I think you've seen many, many examples of it, where the people have been misinformed about the criminal justice system in many, many areas. But I'm certainly not saying that the individual reporter or the news anchor intentionally misinforms. They do what they do because this is what they know. It's the extent of their knowledge. For example, and I'll get back to plea bargaining. I haven't forgotten that question. Reporters love to say that the DA's case is weak because it's based only on circumstantial evidence. Now, the word only is almost always precedes the phrase circumstantial evidence.
Agree with that, Patty?
Well, I would say that you really shouldn't say only when you're reporting something because that's giving a slant to it right away. That's biasing it. If you put that word only in there, that's definitely
Do you think people
influencing.
do it, though?
I would say probably some people do it. I can't say nobody ever does it, but I would hope I would never do that.
Only circumstantial
I've
evidence.
seen it for years, that the case is weak because it's based on circumstantial evidence or only on circumstantial evidence. Well, the people should know, somebody should tell them that a circumstantial evidence case is the strongest case a DA can have. And my hunch is that the reporters who keep saying that the case is weak because it's only circumstantial don't know what they're saying, and they don't know what circumstantial evidence is, and they don't know what other kinds of evidence or categories of evidence.
Can you kind of, for laymen, explain what the difference is and why? I mean, in
Sure.
effect, you say that's really almost the only kind of evidence except what, direct evidence?
Exactly. I mean, evidence is basically broken down into direct evidence, which is eyewitness evidence, which is not always the most reliable evidence. In fact, the DA's office in LA County will not file a case based on one witness ID without corroboration, no matter how positive that witness is. If the identification was of short duration and there's nothing physically distinctive about the suspect, we're not going to file it. And on the other hand, circumstantial evidence is DNA is circumstantial evidence. When we prove that the victim was raped because the defendant's DNA was found at the scene of the rape or on the victim's body, or a murder case, the defendant's fingerprints, for example, is circumstantial evidence. That the defendant was left those prints. So this is
So
powerful
short of a
evidence.
confession, that's probably a lot of what you're going to get as circumstantial evidence.
Circumstantial evidence is very powerful, and the judge instructs the jury that neither category of evidence, direct or circumstantial, should be given more weight than the other. So, and yet, for years and years, I've seen reporters say the case is weak because it's based only on circumstantial evidence. And of course, it's not intentional.
Right.
This is what they've heard, and this is what they repeat.
On CSI.
Back to plea bargaining. The reason that plea bargaining is essential is that because 90% of the defendants plead guilty, we only have to go to trial on a few percent, 2 or 3% jury trials. The rest are court trials, just with the judge. 2%, 3% is the average jury trials. Now, if instead of 90% pleading guilty, 80% pled guilty, we would double our trial, and we couldn't do it. The system couldn't handle it. It would break down.
Because you mentioned sometimes people might campaign on the notion of, reforming plea bargaining or ending plea bargaining,
Right.
which you say is just not realistic in a city
it
the
isn't.
size of Los Angeles.
But I've heard candidates for DA say that I will end plea bargaining. He won't. He won't. There's no question about it.
Do you have any sense, Patty, of how the media, what were your thoughts on plea bargaining before this? Did you, good or thing or bad thing, were they letting somebody off the hook, or?
Well, of course, I don't think most people really like the idea of plea bargaining, but I don't think maybe people have the big picture either of the whole reason behind it, which I didn't either until.
Were you aware that 90% of the people pled guilty?
Yeah, I was really stunned by the statistics in that book. I was amazed, and I had no idea. I really didn't. But I think that, that's a general sense that people think somebody's getting off the hook. They shouldn't be allowed to plea bargain. Here's this bad criminal, and he's getting this way reduced sentence because of this plea bargaining. But also not knowing about like the overcrowded jails and the whole big picture and the money and everything else that's involved in that.
Right.
And you say sometimes, too, there's a stereotype again that, the DA is this vicious person who's just, charging people or looking for, a scapegoat or a guinea pig. But then when you say that 34%, I don't think people are aware that 40% of the crimes, that they reject, that they won't even touch them, and they may argue with the police want them to, and they won't. Because
Well, we
they feel
agree
that-
with the police. Here's the tough part for DAs. The police detective has often worked very hard trying to put a case together. And some young DA rejects it and tells the police officer to go let him go. And the police officer says, you're letting a guilty person go. And we have to say, I know, I agree with you, he's
And you all think he's guilty, but...
And we all think he's guilty. But the bottom line, if I were to summarize the whole criminal justice system in a few words, these would be the words. We need 12, they need 1. That's what this whole system boils down to. We need 12 jurors to get a conviction. They need 1
And you feel that in those 34
to prevent
said,
a conviction.
You won't get it in those cases, you think?
And we make our judgment. And so it's not enough for the DA to believe that the person is guilty. We have to conscientiously believe that based upon the evidence available that's admissible and in envisioning the most likely defense, and we're pretty good at coming up with what anticipating the correct defense. After a few years of doing this, you just about know what the defense is going to be. We are pretty good at guessing whether we can get all 12 jurors or not. And those cases where we don't think we can get all 12 jurors, we have to reject.
We'll be right back. And we are back with Walt Lewis, author of The Criminal Justice Club, and former TV anchor Patty Malone. Well, you say that one thing that has helped a bit this situation is the 3 strikes law, which is not always popular with liberal media, as you say, the LA Times. But how has that changed things in California?
It's had a tremendous effect. In the 10 years following the enactment of 3 strikes, and it was voted in by the people in 1994, between 1994 and 2004, California had a 45% reduction in overall crime, which was the steepest decline in crime in the nation for that 10-year period. And you have to credit 3 Strikes because it got a lot of career criminals off the street and in prison. And this should not be seen as just numbers. What this means is that thousands of victims, potential victims, were spared being victims because of 3 Strikes. And it's been my feeling that the media does not concentrate that much on the victims. They concentrate more on the defendants.
No, that I don't agree with. I think that we give victims a lot of airtime. There's a few things to consider. Number one, rape victims, you can't do it. You can't list their names, et cetera. Number two, a lot of victims don't want the coverage. They don't want to be exposed to it. Those who do, I think the media is more than willing to give them all the coverage they want. For example, when a child is missing, a child's been kidnapped or something, parents will frequently go on TV making a plea to the kidnappers to return the child, et cetera. And I think that situation comes up a lot where the media is more than willing to help out in that kind of a situation. I think they do give the victims a lot of coverage, those that want it.
In that context, I agree completely. When a little girl has been kidnapped or is missing, there is a lot of attention on the victims in that context. But when I said that victims don't get enough attention, I think that when it comes to ballot initiatives, for example, and again, I have to bring up the LA Times, if it comes down to the victim or the defendant, the liberal media tends to go for the defendant. And I don't mean, again, in individual cases that are reported on, but in enacting laws that protect victims, whether it's Jessica's law or child molesters, you can bet that the Times will come down, in effect, against the victim. And that's been shown over and over and over again for the last 30 years.
I'm sorry, we're running out of time, but I wondered, can you give some examples from a practical point of view how sentences have increased since the 3 Strikes law went into effect for some of the more serious crimes?
Well, it's not that the sentences have increased that much.
Or the time served.
it's that it sweeps up more people. Well, for example, let me explain. The meat and potatoes of 3 Strikes is 2 Strikes. Mm-hmm. Because as of a couple of years ago, there were 42,000 second and third strikers in prison.
Okay.
Of the 42,000, 35,000 were 2 strikers. Now, 2 strikers, the sentence for a second strike is doubled. So if it's a 2-year sentence, it's going to be a 4-year sentence. And instead of getting 50% off for good time, work time, you only get 20% off. So it comes down to several months more in prison, but those several months have resulted in cutting the crime rate substantially.
Now, is it also true, you say, that for drug crimes, people basically face practically no prison time at all for the first at least several offenses?
Well, there are all kinds of different drug crimes.
Okay.
Possession of drugs under Prop 36, now possession of any kind of dangerous drug, you have to be convicted 3 times before you can receive a sentence of 30 days. But in LA County, 30 days is 0 because it's under 90 days. So it's just about, Proposition 36 was financed by George Soros, who gave $1 million to get this passed. And it was called the Crime Prevention and Drug Treatment Bill. I doubt that it's ever prevented anything.
Sounds like the release of bill. I don't know. It's like, don't charge him, don't. Well, I guess California has always been liberal about legalization of drugs, that's for sure. Well, I'm sorry, we are out of time. Thank you very much, Patty Malone, former TV anchor, communications professor. Walt Lewis, his book is A Criminal Justice Club. Thanks, everybody, for watching. We'll see you next time.